The growing season is heating up at Singing Cedars Farmstead in Orwell.
Today we're soil steaming. Yeah, so there's a white side and a black side. The white side's going to be on the top now.
Got it.
Becky Maden runs the farm with her husband Scott. She also works for UVM Extension as a vegetable nutrient management specialist.
We have 8 high tunnels, 3 of which have heat in them, so I guess technically they'd be considered a greenhouse to some degree. High tunnels generally mean you're growing in the soil in an unheated structure. And because we're organic, we grow in the soil and with organic systems.
All summer, these high tunnels have been stuffed with tomato plants that stretch from floor to ceiling. Fall means the tomatoes are out and the winter greens are in.
The timeline for establishing winter greens, I think for a lot of farms, it's a pinch point in terms of labor. We're treading the line where we're still harvesting tomatoes and still gaining income on them, and then suddenly you're like, we got to get the greens in. This tunnel was full of tomatoes, and today it's completely ripped out, clean soil, bare soil. We'll have it planted out probably by next week. We plant spinach, lettuces, kales, all sorts of different yummy winter vegetables. Around the same time we do that though, chickweed, which is a winter annual weed, will germinate and outcompete a lot of our greens. And after a couple years, it's become a really big problem to the degree that I think 3 or 4 years ago we lost entire crops. It just really smothered them.
You may have seen chickweed. For farmers who grow in high tunnels, it's an ever-present nuisance.
It's very hard to weed. Like a lot of weeds, it pushes out a lot of seed. The seed viability is very long, and we don't do mechanical cultivation in tunnels, but it's just got a very fibrous root system and is really just challenging to pull out.
Every farm's economics are different. There are a lot of factors to balance in order to stay profitable. For instance, is it worth paying someone to hand weed? Can losses be made up by the market? Soil steaming is a popular and tried and true technique for eradicating weed seeds. Maden's efforts are aimed at fine-tuning this technique for the specific purpose of growing crops in high tunnels.
We completely clear everything out, try to eliminate all the vegetation, and then we'll spread out a tarp on the soil. Underneath that tarp is what's called a sock, a steam sock. It's like a fire hose. It's about 4 inches in diameter, and you run it down the length of the bed, and the tarp is secured with chains. It's tight and it inflates a little bit, and then the steam kind of hits the top of the tarp and then penetrates the soil. And if the soil moisture is perfect, that steam should evenly work its way through it. We're trying to only steam down to 2 inches. And theoretically, below that, the soil biology can kind of stay intact.
Soil steaming has been used by vegetable growers and at flower nurseries for years to kill weeds and pathogens in soil, but its effectiveness has not been studied in high tunnel vegetable production. This is the 3rd year of a grant Maden received from the USDA and the Vermont Department of Agriculture. So far, this project has been full steam ahead, so to speak.
Yes, it works. It's not just killing chickweed and other weed seeds, it's also eliminating Pythium, which is just kind of a ubiquitous root rot fungus in the soil, so it knocks that out. Soil steaming releases nitrate, which is available nitrogen from organically bound forms, and that's been one of the huge bonuses. People are seeing a great yield bump from the steaming process. So it's basically immediately available fertilizer that in an organic system we don't tend to see that kind of burst. And because the weather's cool, day length is dropping, usually winter greens kind of peter along. So in our side-by-side trials the first year, I was like, wow, that's crazy. This bright green lush spinach next to pokey little,
Spinach.
what we're used to. Yeah, we had to dial back our seeding rate after the first year because we were so used to overseeding and losing half of it to Pythium and a bunch of it to chickweed.
The steam eliminates most of, if not all, the weed seeds and other disease-causing plant pathogens. The question is, what's happening to the rest of the soil?
If you're killing the chickweed, what's happening to everything else? In order to answer that question, we took on this trial. Soil biology is a very hard thing to measure. I'm working with Deb Neer's lab up in plant and soil science.
Becky Maden came to me one day and she was describing her interest in using steaming for weed seeds. I informed her, this is really not a very novel technique necessarily. And my experience in plant pathology, I know that greenhouse industry has been using this for decades. What we realized was really novel was how it's being applied in this case, in terms of going with the high tunnels, because they have soil that's there all the time. And so they have to have some way to manage it. And you want to do it a way you don't have to use chemicals.
Rachel Elliott is an undergraduate working in Nair's lab. Her job is to test Maden's soil samples and record the results.
And this machine shoots a little laser through the middle to take the readings.
The color blue on this chart indicates microbial activity. The darker the blue, the more activity. A good sign that matches Nair's hypothesis.
We see changes, so it's as I predicted, but it's not a detrimental thing. It's a short-lived, it's kind of as I would expect. I think it has promise here for use in Vermont.
The use of high tunnels on vegetable farms in Vermont and in the Northeast has become more and more widespread as farmers look to extend the growing season by planting high-value winter greens.
We have 8 tunnels now, we're building 2 more. So as we scale up, we want to mechanize. And mechanize means having a more uniform stand and not having, if you're cutting by hand, you can work your way around weeds, but on a larger scale, that's something we're working our way towards. And so as this industry builds and the markets build, we need ways to kind of scale up. So we've created this environment in these tunnels. For my work with UVM Extension, I've spent a lot of time on high tunnel fertility, particularly for tomatoes, which is a summer crop, and it's all about like boosting your nitrogen and potassium, which interestingly is exactly what chickweed thrives in. So we've created this ideal environment for it to really take off.
To borrow a phrase, into each life a little rain, or in this case, steam, must fall. The cost of the equipment can be expensive, not to mention the cost of the fuel to run it.
This is a $30,000 piece of equipment, not really feasible for most farms here, and you only use it a couple of days of the year. To put it in perspective, it takes about 55 gallons of fuel, diesel or kerosene, to do a 30 by 90 house. So one standard high tunnel. That's like kind of more than we use on our farm all year here. We don't use a lot of fuel and tractors. And you multiply that out to, if we were to do all 8 tunnels, it becomes a little bit staggering.
Think of soil steaming like applying fertilizer. We know fertilizer works, but what's the optimal amount to apply, and what's the best way to manage it? Despite her reservations about fuel cost, Maden likes the results she's seen. But she understands that each farm is different, and farmers have to weigh the financial and environmental costs for themselves.
I think our job at UVM is to kind of spend the time doing the research, but also connecting with the other people doing this. It's funny, sometimes with Extension, I think that's what we're doing, is taking farmers' questions, researching them, coming up with data, and then as we present the data, they're like, well, yeah, I mean, that's what I've observed.
I love talking to farmers. They're the ones that really generate my research ideas, because I say, what are your main problems? What are you struggling with? My ideal research project is one that you learn some basic biology, but you have an application. So there's always that application that fits very much with the outreach land grant mission. They tell me their stories, which I, think of as anecdotal information. And so I feel like my role is to try to understand how and why that happens. And if that's a general thing, but that's the science part, is learning how and why.
As high tunnels continue to rise in Vermont, so too will the challenges they present. The same can be said for the researchers from UVM who will have to rise to meet those challenges. In Orwell, I'm Keith Silva with Across the Fence.